Hi, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in to Reimagine Chicago Ideas from Education. I'm Susie An, an education reporter at WBEZ and your moderator for tonight. I thought we could get started with a little overview of what Reimagine Chicago is all about. This past spring and summer, as many of you probably heard, WBEZ has examined 4 institutions and systems that play a pivotal role in Chicago's civic life: city government, community investment, public safety, and our topic for tonight, schools. Throughout our conversations on 91.5 and during live events like this, we've explored how these institutions and systems might work better for Chicago residents and build a more equitable city. The project is a collaboration between WBEZ and the University of Chicago's Center for Effective Government at the Harris School of Public Policy. Tonight, 5 guests join us to discuss our public school systems and consider other ways to do school. We'll discuss how our traditional education system came to be and learn about alternative educational models, including elements that might enhance public education. And of course, we also want to hear from you, and we want you to participate in tonight's discussion. If you have questions or suggestions for ways we might reimagine public education in Chicago, go ahead and drop those in the comment sections, and we'll try to weave as many of them into the discussion as possible. Now, kicking us off is Tim Knowles. He's the president of the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. Tim is no stranger to Chicago, having founded and served as director and chairman of the University of Chicago Urban Education Institute and the University of Chicago Urban Labs. Tim, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Well, let's dive right in. The current model of public education is standards-based and built around standardized testing, seat time, and compliance. How did we get to this model of public education?
This is a 2-week seminar, right? I just want to make sure I'm in the right place. No, how did we get here? There's 2 main historical arcs. First was Horace Mann. Horace Mann went to Prussia in the 1850s, and he fell in love with what was there, and what he saw he brought back, and it spread like wildfire. It became the common school then, and basically foundational to our public system. What's most interesting is if you read the letters that he wrote home while he was there, and what he describes to his wife Mary in particular were bells between classes, common curriculum and assessments, students sitting in rows, grouped by age, and an educational bureaucracy sitting above the schools. In those letters, you realize he is describing our system in a way that is just hardwired into our psyche. The second historical arc is, for better or worse, from the institution for which I'm responsible. In the early 1900s, universities said, we need a way to determine whether students applying to our schools are actually ready for their collegiate studies. And the Carnegie Unit was born. And in essence, the idea is that a certain amount of time in the classroom represents a certain amount of learning. And what we know today now is seat time. But the thing about the Carnegie Unit that I think not everyone realizes, though many have heard of it, is it has become the currency of our educational economy. It's embedded everywhere. What's taught, what is assessed, how we think about learning, what goes on to a transcript, who's eligible for financial aid and who is not, and whether schools are even accredited or not. So together, Mann and the Carnegie Unit are about as big an influence on what we think of when we think of school today as any forces I can think of.
Well, let's fast forward 100, 150, 200 years from Horace Mann. What is the goal of the standards-based model?
I think that the basic goal was to say, can we raise achievement, academic achievement for all young people across the nation? That was a laudable and important goal. But one of the things we have to realize is just how constrained a goal that is in terms of academic learning defined narrowly by particular skills which are learned in this context, in this box called the schoolhouse, in these little boxes in the schoolhouse called classrooms, have led to some forms of progress, but have overlooked massive amounts of what it means to be to lead a successful, family sustaining and life full of choices, which is presumably something like what we want for young people.
And now it kind of sounds like you're not maybe the biggest fan of the current model. What are maybe some of the pitfalls of a standards-based model?
I mean, the pitfall one is the idea that time and learning be conflated is ridiculous. We know, just research tells us, common sense, practitioners tell us that some people learn some things at some rates and other things at other rates. So if the fundamental building block of schooling doesn't take into consideration what we know about how people learn, then that's without a doubt a major constraint of the current system. Second pitfall I would put on the list is the American system has ceased to accelerate racial and social and economic mobility. And Raj Chetty, a great economist, has created unambiguous evidence that since the 1940s, there has been basically a precipitous drop in the extent to which education has propelled people along the economic ladder. And the third pitfall I would put on the list is revealed by listening to employers, and they're consistently telling us that they're not getting the workforce they need from American schools. There are huge skill gaps, academic skills to be sure, but also other skills that we know we need to prevail in the workplace.
Well, the standards-based model is a large part of our current system. So what skills does it actually give our kids? What skills do we want them to acquire?
In very short form, because I can't wait to get to the part of the panel where people are going to imagine what might be. The standards-based reform has pushed the American system in a assertive way towards relatively narrowly defined academic skills in a set body of discipline. But what we know is that they're hugely important skills that we expect young people to develop, and we're sort of, there's this tacit assumption that they'll develop them outside of school because we're not doing them at school, like empathy and curiosity and creativity, agency, grit, the persistence we know young people need, or the ability to collaborate. So the intentionality that has been brought to bear with regard to standards, we haven't even really scraped the surface in terms of those other dimensions that when you talk to employers, when you talk to parents, those are the things that they want young people to bring with them in the day.
Issues of equity have been brought to the foreground, especially during the pandemic. So are there specific negative impacts for students of color with this model?
Yes, you can look at almost any point on the educational continuum. Kindergarten suspension rates, third grade reading levels, high school graduation, post-secondary entry and success, and see evidence that the existing methods are failing a vast number of young people, particularly first generation Black, Latinx, and Indigenous young people. But even more damning, in my view, is revealed by looking at longer term outcomes. And there was a study done by the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and Duke and the New School that looked at average net worth of families by race in cities across America. White families on average in their study were worth $227,000. Puerto Rican families were worth $3,020. African-American families were worth $8, their net family worth, and Dominican families were worth $0. When you have income gaps that are that wide and wealth gaps that are that wide, that's cause for us to be having this conversation. certainly it will lead to huge amounts of frustration, but in communities that are least well served. But longer term, it's just not sustainable as a society to create a democratic society that is undergirded by that level of inequity. So that's the reason that thinking about the future of learning and thinking about instantiations of what can happen next is so critical.
I want to shift a bit. What role do teachers' unions and the structure of school boards, whether mayoral, control, or elected, and other institutions play in shaping our current model of public education?
America has this funny system, and it's based on something called democratic localism. So school districts that refuse to teach evolution or even mention a person called Charles Darwin can exist. And the opposite also can exist. And so our the public system that we've created then isn't going to change markedly from some top-down methodology, whether it's the federal government or even at the state level, because there's so much power built into the base of the system and so much voice that was designed from the beginning in terms of local school boards in large measure making fundamental decisions about how money is spent, what children learn, and so forth. So we're not Singapore, and we're not France, and we're not South Korea. Those aren't the right models for us to really look like. What we're talking about today in terms of significant shifts that would lead to more equitable outcomes for young people is going to have to come from the local level. So that's a challenge for America, and it's a hard one. The other challenge in terms of whether it's school boards or labor unions, but particularly school districts, is the churn challenge, the turnover challenge. Prior to Janice Jackson in Chicago, there were 7 superintendents in 8 years. And that level of churn is also visible in classrooms and in schools and on elected boards. So one of the outcomes of that churn, in my view, is that districts and often schools themselves also have programmatic churn, which is even more damning or problematic for young people. So new projects, new curriculum, sort of a silver bullet syndrome is a normal syndrome of American school improvement. And we've been at it for decades, and there's not a lot of evidence that it helps. So I wouldn't say the fundamental architecture of labor management, school systems with school boards is a problem unto themselves. It's not a governance problem we're talking about. We're really talking about a teaching and learning problem.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple of questions left before we turn to audience questions. But Tim, as you know, a lot happened with schools during the pandemic. Do you think this is a good moment to try to reimagine schools? You know, what lessons do you hope we take away from remote learning and how schools responded to the pandemic?
It's a question that I hear asked all across the country right now, and I think I'm Dickensian in this regard. It's sort of the tale of two cities, in the sense that on one hand, there's a rush back to what we know because we know it was better than what we had over the last 18 or 24 months. I worry about that rush back, and it is better. And so there's lots of reasons to say, let's actually get back to having young people be socialized, not in front of a laptop, but with each other. But as we're reminded again and again, the inequities in the old system were absolutely stark and visible. So what makes me hopeful, I would say I'll give 3 quick examples. One, I think if you talk to high school students, almost to a student, and I saw survey data and I can't remember from where recently, they want a hybrid high school experience. They want to be able to be in school part of the time to do the things they need to do in school, whether it's labs or sports or engage with each other, but they also want opportunities to be outside of the box of and I think we'll see that happen. I think we'll see hybrid versions of high school emerge quite quickly. There are people working on it now, and I think if districts are, if the opportunities are available to school systems, I think they'll start taking root, and that creates a really interesting set of opportunities to start leveraging cities, for example, and all the assets that cities have for students more systematically. The second example I'll say quickly is who I would call the new experientialists. And we have one on this call, and maybe more, but Imran is definitely one. Those who are thinking about education outside the classroom and have built models of experiential education that are rigorous, engaging, and lead to really, really impressive outcomes. So I'm hopeful that there's going to be a moment where where we're face to face both with the inequities that came before and have the opportunity to engage organizations like Embark much more systematically. The third reason I don't know whether I'm hopeful or not, this is Dickensian again, but post-secondary education was pushed to the brink before the pandemic. They were suffering from a business model that was broken and not sustainable, and many institutions know it. I think there's an opportunity in the next decade to reimagine what post-secondary looks like, to think about what are really rigorous, really experiential, really affordable, and really career-aligned models that would serve a much greater swath of our nation.
Yeah. Well, my next question, you may have answered it a little bit in that last response, but I wanted to ask if you might offer a bold idea to reimagine public education. Is there one idea you've seen in practice elsewhere, regardless of educational model, that might enhance traditional public schooling here in Chicago?
I would figure out how to credit learning that doesn't happen in the schoolhouse. And I would do that at big scale. You have organizations in Chicago like After School Matters, which is the largest after-school program for high school kids in the country. It serves something like 17,000 young people a year. Young people show up, they can study anything from aeronautics to cooking and dance, music. They get to do lots of things that they're passionate about. Why isn't that what we call school? And could we build a city and a system that made those sorts of learning opportunities part of what we define as the trajectory towards school and high school graduation, and take us away from and one of the things, as you might have conjectured, I'm interested in Carnegie doing, is thinking about what does a post-Carnegie unit ecosystem actually mean? What does it look like? I think there's huge opportunity for engaging young people and getting them excited about learning, and also leveraging the assets of a city in a much more productive way.
I want to squeeze in an audience question here before we move on to our next panel. Bruce from YouTube asks, the core question of education may be, what do we want people to be able to do well? Do you have thoughts or sources on this?
Sources. I've got secret sources. I'm afraid I can't reveal them, Bruce, from YouTube. No, it's a great question, and there isn't consensus around that. I think what there is consensus around is that we want people to have choices. We want, whether it's choice to go to college or to go on some other track when they finish high school, choice when you finish post-secondary school to have the skills and capacities to choose a career that you're passionate about, whether it's running a hedge fund or being a nurse. And we should measure the extent of our success not on getting aligned around one particular purpose of school, but getting aligned around or demonstrating that the the opportunity that we've created opportunity for young people all the way along the continuum to make those choices.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll have to leave it there for now. Tim, thanks so much for joining us
My pleasure.
For your knowledge. A quick reminder to everyone tuning in, go ahead and drop any questions or comments you may have in the comments section. When asked about ideas you would implement to advance education in Chicago, Deb said personal assessments of learning styles, strengths, and challenges, followed by coaching students how to use their strengths to address their challenges. And Michelle said outdoor learning, multi-age learning, allowing older kids to help with the little ones, but also for the little ones who are ready to help some of the older ones on the same level. Thanks for that. Now that we've talked about traditional public education, let's dig deeper into the ideas portion of our program. Many of you may have heard about competency-based learning, reforms that focus on student demonstrating mastery of learning over time spent in classrooms. Joining us next are two proponents of this reform. Susan Patrick is president and CEO of the Aurora Institute, a DC-based nonprofit that advocates for competency-based education and personalized learning. And also with us is Juan Carlos Ocon, principal of Benito Juarez Community Academy, a competency-based Chicago public high school in the Pilsen neighborhood. Susan and Juan, welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Susan, I'll start with you. Lay the groundwork for us. What is competency-based learning?
Sure. Thanks for the question, too. We've been doing research on this for the last 20 years, and K through 12 competency-based education, it's also in higher ed and in workforce training, even military training. But when we think of competency-based ed, it's also called mastery-based education, and it simply means students advance based on mastery of content knowledge and skills, rather than seat time or hours on task. Actually, when New Hampshire made a bold move to support competency-based learning as a state, they redefined their Carnegie units in terms of competencies. So when we're rethinking what a Carnegie unit or how students advance, we think about them demonstrating those knowledge and skills. Just to go a little bit deeper, the Aurora Institute Competency Works published a definition of competency-based education that has 7 elements that are needed to implement quality models of competency-based schools. And it's really important, number one, that students are empowered daily to make decisions. They're setting goals on what they're going to learn, how they're going to create knowledge, how they're going to apply knowledge. Number 2 is that assessment is meaningful to students. They're actually, that they've even reached mastery or they haven't yet, and it yields evidence of their student learning. 3 is that students are getting immediate support and feedback from their teachers. If a student doesn't demonstrate mastery, they're getting help until they're ready for the next unit or level. They've got it, they're ready to move on. 4, students are progressing or advancing based on this evidence of mastery and not seat time. 5, students are learning actively with flexibility in the path, the pace, and even the place, learning inside and outside of school. Competency-based education supports these blended and hybrid models as a structure. 6, it's equity-driven. If you think about strategies to ensure equity are embedded for more responsive and inclusive learning opportunities. And last, the 7th element is that learning targets are clear, they're explicit, and they're measurable. So all students, and all means all, are held to these high standards. Finally, the teachers are really using competency-based ed to personalize learning for each student and tailor the instruction to better meet their needs and give them voice and choice. Thanks.
Having personalized learning sounds great, but how common is competency-based learning, Susan?
Yeah, it's getting more common in the United States, but it's happening all around the world. So when you look at these high-performing countries and go and visit schools, they have clear competencies. They're really working on building skills. Most of them have unpacked subject domains so that students are learning in projects and they're able to piece together and connect English and the science and arts and math and do project-based or phenomenon-based learning. So when we look across the US, we estimate that 8 to 10% of US public school districts are actually planning or beginning to implement competency-based education. There are thousands of schools, and we've visited hundreds of them. It's important to note that it's a design process. This is coming from educators. They're being built from the ground up with educators working with communities, working with parents and students, calling for new designs that support every student getting to mastery. Again, and it's interesting, there was a recent survey, 91% of parents in the US want schools to be reimagined. So the time is really right.
Mm-hmm. Well, beyond mastery, what is the goal for this model for our students?
Yeah, I think the goal goes back to a question you just asked, which is we know the traditional kind of factory model, it's a one size fits all system, is not producing the desired outcomes. So we need to stop tweaking. We keep tweaking with our reforms the existing system and examine why it's not working. So take a step back, and we really do need to focus on examining what is the purpose of K through 12 education, and think about the nature that our traditional system is so geared around those Prussian ideals of ranking and sorting kids. So when we think about, we boil down an entire student's K through 12 experience into a single GPA number, rank and sort kids. If we reframe this around what is the purpose, are we wanting education to ensure that all students have healthy and prosperous futures? Are we designing education for excellence and human flourishing? You end up in a very different place. And that is if we begin by designing our schools based on the research on how students learn best and design for the outcomes that we hope students know and can do, and backwards map from that, we can actually transform how everyday teaching and learning happens. So in this competency-based system, failure may be part of a student's learning process, but it is not an outcome. Success is the outcome and the goal.
And I want to get Juan Carlos in here in just a moment. But before I do, Susan, you mentioned looking at this for the past 20 years. And, speaking of outcomes, what are you seeing so far in the past couple of decades of competency-based learning?
Yeah, we've got promising evaluations and research are emerging. So Chugach, Alaska has been doing competency-based learning since 1994. In 2001, they were the only school district or education institution to ever win a Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award. And you're seeing tremendous growth, increases in their graduation rates, and later success. But one thing is, districts doing competency-based education know where every student is every day in building their knowledge and skills. So the amount of information that Chugach has or other competency districts have mean that we can actually pinpoint how we support students, how we improve our education system as a whole. And I just challenge people to think, wow, what could our accountability systems look like in the US that would actually be aligned to and support student-centered learning? There are a number of other studies that Marzano has done, the American Institutes for Research, that really point to the improvements in teacher practice and improvements in student outcomes in competency-based models. And I mentioned New Hampshire before, which has been leading a statewide move to competency-based education since the early 2000s. They have a performance assessment for competency education program, and their study results showed positive impacts on teaching practices and student learning, really driven by students creating real evidence of their knowledge and skills through performance assessments.
Well, let's talk more about real students getting through this model. Juan Carlos, at your school at Juarez, you went from a traditional model to the competency-based learning. So what does that actually look like in the classroom? What does a competency-based learning classroom look like?
Yeah, and Susan, thank you for giving us the context. What it really looks like, especially as Susan articulated, the fact that students are at the center of competency-based education, and that means that it is about learning, and it's not about time-based structures that rank and sort students, but rather about engagement and about learning. So what that means for us is that as a school, we have to foster physically and emotionally safe spaces that are affirming, welcoming, and meaningful for all students. That means that teachers intentionally plan for, model, and enact specific classroom routines and practices, right? If that is done, then we will create classroom environments that feel, look, and sound very different than the classrooms that students are used to. That means that teachers will create authentic opportunities for students to dialogue and reflect, and that will be responsive to students' interest, their passions, and what is happening currently, the context that we live in. And that is very critical and something that doesn't happen in a traditional classroom. Susan mentioned also clear purpose, clear process, right? It's not just about clear and explicit competencies, but also processes for learning that need to be highlighted and referenced throughout any individual lesson, right? That makes learning explicitly clear and the expectations around that explicitly clear. The classroom and the classroom setup reflects and should capture students' voice, identity, contributions, experience. And that is definitely something that is very complicated and very difficult to do in a traditional classroom, not so in a competency-based classroom, because the classroom in a CBE environment is really an inclusive space that reflects diverse communities, cultures, histories, and contributions. And so there's a co-construction, co-design, right, between students and teachers that happens. And by so doing, that means that students and teachers both have the power to design and create their own learning.
Yeah. Well, Juan Carlos, I guess give us a comparison. Let's say we're in a high school English class. What is the difference between a traditional high school English class and a competency-based model?
Well, in a traditional classroom, in addition to the traditional structures like traditional seating roles that, again, Susan mentioned and Tim mentioned earlier, really just serve to sort and categorize. In that traditional classroom, there are structures in place that revolve around the Carnegie unit that are time-based structures that don't necessarily allow for creativity because everything really is dependent on that Carnegie unit or traditional letter grades that really do not help students' outcomes, right, or assessments. There are credit recovery opportunities instead of really focusing on an assets model, right? Or there's tracking that happens in a traditional classroom. Instead, what we focus on is making sure that students feel safe and free to express their own cultures and backgrounds in classes. There is flexible grouping. There is innovative setup that allows for student voice and student choice in a very real way. That means that students and teachers, for example, can co-construct the norms or the expectations in a classroom. And those co-constructed norms will be made visible and are referenced throughout the lesson, throughout the year, right? Because they really are what motivates students.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Juarez has been under this model for about 5 years now. What benefits do you see this bringing for students?
What we have heard from students is that they are seeing themselves now in the curriculum, right? Black and brown students of color are being reflected in our curriculum. Our teachers are intentionally planning, right, to address the needs of our students. And that means making sure that students have access to materials and literature by and about authors of color. The curriculum, the material reflects our students' lived experiences. And because they are seeing themselves in the curriculum, and because they are given the power to co-construct and co-design, they can actually focus on learning. They're more engaged. It's more meaningful and relevant to them rather than memorizing curriculum that really is not familiar or will not be familiar to them in the present or in the future.
And because Juarez, transitioned from a traditional model to a competency-based model, I'm curious, maybe it isn't easy to do, but can you talk about the struggles around implementing this model in terms of teacher or maybe even parent buy-in?
To be honest with you, we have tremendous support from parents because, as Susan articulated earlier, and Tim also, this is about students. This is about us capturing when students actually learn. The beauty of this is that we now know that we all learn in different ways and at different paces. And the beauty of competency-based education is that we really work together as a school community to create the structures and systems of support that allow us to capture when learning happens. Because we recognize and learn and have learned that learning happens outside of the four walls of this box that Tim described, right? Competency-based education really is about ensuring that students are successful in their own learning. What has been difficult for us is that we are still in a system that is driven by the Carnegie unit and time-based structures. And that has created so many arbitrary structures in school settings. Mm-hmm. And so here at Juarez, we have the support of the fact that we are part of an Illinois State Board of Education pilot around competency-based education. And we have supports that will allow us to not only disrupt these inequitable practices that have been described, but really dismantle them, right? And begin to focus on learning-based structures and not on time-based structures. But at the same time, we are in a system that still practices uses the Carnegie units and traditional letter grades. And so in many ways, we are doing good work, but we are doing it in isolation.
Yeah, that's a good point to make. Before we turn to audience questions, I want to put this question to you both. If you're in a school that isn't all competency-based, what's one piece of your model that might enhance a traditional school structure? And Susan, I'll start with you.
Sure. One place to start definitely is increasing student agency, creating more learner-centered environments where students have voice and choice in their learning. That co-design, personalizing learning that's culturally responsive and inclusive is absolutely critical. And really the assessment process, how they demonstrate that learning, to have it be more meaningful with performance assessments or authentic assessments that produce, students' creativity. They're creating work to demonstrate their learning. Student agency and performance assessments are really good places to start.
And Juan Carlos?
I would definitely agree with that, and would just add that these developmental relationships that Susan is describing are so important and so critical to really creating that environment that we are both describing, one that is truly inclusive and safe for students to really be who they are, and that help them become who they are going to become. And so relationships are developmental when people really discover who they are, and when they develop abilities to shape their own lives. And by doing so, they're going to be able to engage with and contribute to their world. And so we need to restructure schools to focus on these developmental relationships that create this agency that Susan just described.
Yeah. Well, I want to get in a couple of audience questions here before we move on to our next panel. Manuel from YouTube asks, what systems must change for competency-based education to work? I don't know who wants to take that one on.
I mean, I'm happy to. Some of what Tim said, the traditional system has very narrow outcomes, and literacy and numeracy are absolutely essential, but no longer sufficient. The fact that the system is time-based, based on the bell schedule, and kids move on with these huge gaps is a major structural issue that can be changed and needs to be changed. And we touched a little bit on grading practices, but they have major variability depending on grading from different teachers, whether behaviors are included with it, extra credit based on non-academic learning. So competency-based assessments are really calibrated on separating those out and highlighting what students actually know and can do, or what they need extra support for. And just the last two things are this fact that traditional education models are largely built on deficit models, ranking and sorting kids. So thinking about how we can have asset frames around our youth and youth development, and how we can better showcase students' strengths, knowledge, and assets in their communities as well is really important. We need to be building our schools on growth mindset, on all kids. We know all kids can learn, and supporting all kids for their learning.
And we've got a question from LaQuasha from Facebook. And the question is, how does competency-based learning look for diverse learners, students with special needs? Sure, if anyone wants to, either of you would like to take that one on. Juan Carlos or Susan?
Yeah, I'm happy to. When you think about how a traditional system is supporting students with special needs, they're often saying you need tier 1 support, tier 2 support. The system of a competency-based system and personalization and that differentiation that is so key around individualized education plans goes hand in hand. So a competency-based model from the get-go has a personalized learning plan for every student. And you think about what gets selected for a tier 1 or a tier 2 intervention. Many of those interventions are part of the classroom every day. And so there's greater differentiation, and those supports, which are part of the classroom, the supports that students need and the resources are really reorganized around student needs. So it is very much aligned with universal design for learning and how we can best serve all of our students.
Mm-hmm. And we've got a question again from Bruce from YouTube, and Bruce asks, competencies to do what? Who defines what students need to do well?
Yeah, it's back to his original question, and I was going to comment on this earlier. Because we have a devolved system or local control in the US, which Tim mentioned earlier, we don't have a national system. If we had a national system, we would be doing a national curriculum redesign. But we have a local system. So it's really local communities engaging in this important conversation around what is the purpose of education and what do students need to know and be able to do. And in lots of communities, they're engaging in these conversations where they might call them profile of a graduate, portrait of a graduate, in communities and school districts all across the US, but also in states. So South Carolina, Virginia, Utah, have deep portrait of a graduate conversations where they redefine student success from those narrow outcomes more holistically. And that gives you your North Star. So that essentially are communities and states setting up what students need to know and be able to do upon graduating.
And Cynthia from YouTube says, quote, "I'm disappointed that this is so high level in concept. The issue is in implementation. It's great to say that teachers tailor learning to each student, but teachers don't have the flexibility. How can teachers get that flexibility?" Maybe this is a question for you, Juan Carlos.
I think that in practice, local schools, while we are part of Chicago Public Schools, for example, or the district level, we do have some autonomy to really focus on learning and not necessarily focus on these time-based structures. Juarez is part of CPS, and we have been doing competency-based education for some time now. And while we are learning together as a school community, we are really reimagining and reinventing teaching and learning here at Juarez. So and we are a neighborhood school here at Juarez in Chicago. And if we can do it here, it can certainly be done in local schools everywhere across the United States.
And we'll have to leave it there. Susan and Juan, thanks so much for joining us this evening and for sharing your perspectives on competency-based learning with us, as well as your experience with this educational model. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And again, a reminder to drop any questions or comments you may have in the comments section. Ideas from viewers to advance education in Chicago include Allison, who said greater connection to cultural institutions. Khalid said, consider year-long schooling with more breaks. And Stephen said, the more self-direction and trust we build into our schools, the more authentic the learning. And we have one more panel joining us this evening to discuss two other alternatives to traditional education. Andrea Schaefer is the faculty director of the Chicago Waldorf School that supports the development of self-directed exploration. And Imran Khan is the CEO and co-founder of Embark Chicago, a program that provides community-driven, experience-based learning opportunities to low-income high school students. Andrea and Imran, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Andrea, I'll start with you. Just first tell us about the Waldorf School and your educational model.
Thanks. I'm going to use a lot of terms that are different from what's already been talked about. And I want to preface everything I say by telling you that I am the daughter of a public school teacher. So I had a lot of insight growing up as to what my mother's experiences were in the classroom and in schools. And following up on a little bit of what was said about what they're doing at Juarez, I want to say that our educational model is based on some foundational assumptions. And one is that teachers know how to teach, and the other one is that students want to learn. So I think a lot of when people talk about the Carnegie Unit and all of these kind of outside controls on what happens in a classroom, it really is a fundamental distrust that teachers don't have the ability to make decisions about what they teach, how they teach, and how they address the students that are sitting in front of them. And I also think that kind of distrust where you are not engaging students and asking them to be active learners, it wears away at their initiative. And so I think what we assume is that all students come in with a natural curiosity. They're not a blank slate. They, as a matter of fact, they're not empty. We're not going to try to push a bunch of content into them because content is everywhere in our culture now. But what we want them to do is have a chance to explore any questions that they have. We want them to ask better questions. And it's our job then is to give them as many ways as possible to explore those questions. So that's a little bit high level, but we are a developmental approach. So we don't think faster is better. We think it's fine to kind of swim in a content area, and that it's good for students to linger there. We don't have grades in our elementary school. We do assess grades in our high school. We are a K through 12 school at the Chicago Waldorf School. We have large looping. So a teacher will stay with a class from anywhere from 3 to 8 years and will teach most of the core subjects. We do not have a reliance on textbooks. And as a matter of fact, we ask students to demonstrate their knowledge in what we call morning lesson books, which are kind of like they make their own textbooks, but they also might demonstrate their knowledge in other ways by making a presentation. Or one of my favorite blocks is in the 9th grade where they talk about the human skeleton and they model it out of clay. So there are other ways, that you can demonstrate what you've learned. We also teach in a block system. So we will go very deeply into a subject for 3 to 4 weeks for several hours a day. And then we will switch into another subject. And we integrate art into all of the subjects, but not because we're an art school. And I think that can be something that is confusing to people about a Waldorf school. We are using art, just like the example I gave about the skeleton, in service to the other subjects. So we are thinking that music makes you a better listener, and that learning how to sketch something makes you a better observer, which is helpful in science. Actually, both of those things. And we also finally really are connected to the outdoors. And I say the outdoors instead of nature because we are connected to nature, but we're an urban school. So we want to be connected to our neighborhood and the things that we find in our neighborhood, which is sometimes trees and sometimes stores. So yeah.
And I'm sure this is quite unfamiliar to many folks. So I guess describe maybe what a morning might look like at the Waldorf School for an elementary age student.
Sure. I'm just going to preface by saying, of course, COVID changed a lot of things for everybody, and it did for us. So what I'm going to describe is what you would experience mostly outside of the COVID circumstance. But you will not see screens in our classrooms for the most part. During COVID, of course, we had to make a lot of adaptations and we learned a lot. Some of what we learned was, very positive. But in general, we're a low tech school and you will see 100% students moving. We do not expect students to be sitting at a desk for these long periods of lessons that I talked about. And they will be jumping rope and they will be climbing and they will be doing dances from any cultures that they're learning about or that enhance their geography lessons. They will be doing all kinds of movement. And certainly there is the, reading, writing, arithmetic, and you'll see math on the board and you'll see writing and you'll hear students reading or see them reading. But you're also very likely to see beautiful pictures that are drawn on the boards, or them doing colored sand mandalas to enhance their learning about ancient India. Or you might smell bread when you walk through the building because some of our younger students make bread once a week and soup once a week. And we really are trying to imbue our educational environment with and really address all the senses. So our basics are not reading, writing, and arithmetic, although we teach those, but it's light and sound and form and movement, et cetera, and so on.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this isn't a model that most kids will have access to. So, Andrea, how can this model be made more equitable? How could there be increased access for kids across the city?
There are Waldorf charter schools, so that's one thing. I think schools that are independent / private, begun to be private or independent, sometimes because they were saying they were doing what the traditional model was, but doing it better or more accelerated or in a way to be exclusive. For Waldorf schools, we are different. And so that's why we are independent. And so we don't have a desire to be exclusive. That being said, there are economic realities, but for us, we try to give every family access to our education that can. So we have a $1.5 million tuition assistance program, and approximately 50% of our students receive some kind of aid. And we do have about 10% of our students that qualify as low income. We also are affiliated with 1,000 Waldorf schools around the world. So it's not just about financial access, but it's about, is there a Waldorf school near you? And how does that look in different places? So there's a Waldorf school, for example, in Zanzibar that is serving orphaned female Muslim girls. And then there's another Waldorf school in South Dakota on the Pine Ridge Reservation that is a Lakota Sioux Waldorf school, and it is very imbued with their community values there too. And they are very, very economically challenged at that school.
Well, Imran Khan, I want to turn to you. Embark Chicago has a very interesting program. Tell us the basics about your experiential model of education and how it's different from a traditional approach.
Yeah, happy to. So I think one of the ways to think about this is imagining if the 370,000 students in Chicago Public Schools in our city get to learn once a month regularly in businesses and restaurants and universities, in the cultural community, in the community organizations really close by, in the cultural treasures that we have. It's the idea about thinking how learning can go beyond the classroom, not just as something you do once in a while, but as an important tool that we would call, and I think many educators and many of the callers and who have made comments would believe, are more important than papers and pen. I mean, it is the building block of what makes us who we are, the experiences we have. You ask any of us to think about what experience that we have that shaped what we stand for today. And it is not about the books, the papers, and the pens necessarily. It is about the places you've been, the people you've seen, the conversations you got a chance to be a part of, the actions you took in hand in hand with your community around you. And for us, Embark is a model in which you start thinking about the city becoming a classroom and learning going beyond the classroom walls. So to be a very tangible, what Embark does is provide a comprehensive set of tools for public schools to implement this type of learning, experiences outside of the classroom, workshops into the classroom, integrate that so that young people across an entire school are having it monthly. Also train the teachers so that they know how to leverage and prioritize building relationships, understanding young people, and being able to guide that growth and that experience, and then providing schools operational tools to implement. You would imagine a school with 1,400 students, what it looks like to go on field experience days, how you move 1,400 kids in a single day, the places they go, what roles every single person in the building takes, how you track young people's experiences that they're having, how teachers design new ones, and how you can see what a young person is experiencing freshman year all the way through junior year. And so we also integrate curriculum across the whole school for social emotional learning, but also the power of an experience is all in it. In order to make it a rigorous process, you think about what you do before, what you do during, and what you do after. And you see the entire thing, all of that in all the skills that you need to be consistently interacting with your classmates, with your teachers, with the community organizations around you. I think a caller talked about multi-generational learning. This has to happen, but these are the things that the school building and the school classrooms, they trap us, they trap our young people. They, in a sense, form a type of incarceration where for 18 to 17 years of a young person's life, they can go an entire school career without ever being around someone of a different race, socioeconomic class. And these are realities in our city right here. And until we're able to reimagine our school, building the box, and how we can operationalize going beyond that, how we can create rigorous, meaningful interactions, multi-generational, within our communities, beyond it, across race, across socioeconomic status, we are always going to be failing our young people, no matter what we do.
Well, to that point, Imran, you taught at Harper High School, a Chicago public school in West Englewood on the south side when you created this model. I'm curious, what was sort of that light bulb moment that kind of led you to create Embark Chicago?
I'm born and raised in the city of Chicago, and I didn't have very much growing up. I faced my family faced a lot of poverty. And I thought I was going to become a teacher to be the type of teacher that could relate to my students, that could share real perspectives that looked like them, a little more like them, and had experiences like them. And then I became a teacher at Harper, and I realized, whoa, this is a different world. What does this type of challenge, what does the type of violence that our young people experience, what does that mean every day as our young people come into the classroom? And so I had a chance of seeing hundreds of students every year come through my classroom walls and sit at the tables in front of me. And what I quickly realized was that the type of learning we are providing our young people, it's not only boring, which anybody around here will tell you. I mean, it is not just boring. It is, I would go as far to say, it is perpetuating a system of oppression. It is enforcing an idea in our minds about the world being small, and the possibilities that we have are not being shown to us. So when I saw my young people who had, they didn't understand why we were learning Macbeth, what it made sense for, what was the whole point of the college experience, how you go through life, and how all of this connects. That's when I realized, until we were able to show young people experiences, none of this was going to make sense. I'll tell you a quick story. I remember when one of my young people, who I realized that hadn't gone to a grocery store, his name, well, I won't share his name, but he was going to go to I was taking him to Whole Foods, and he said, pulled me aside and he said, Mr. Khan, there's no way I'm going there. I'm not going to go over there so that they laugh at me and make a fool of, and I make a fool of myself. He's like, we don't belong there, so I'm not going. And that was just when the Whole Foods in Lincoln Park had opened up. And I remember when he told me that, I stepped back and I go, whoa, the ideas of separation and where we belong and where we don't belong, of worth, that is something that is not a physical fence. It is an internal manifestation. And it is an internal sense. We want our world and our schools to tell our young people that they belong, that they deserve everything, that they just need to go out and get it. However, everything around our world tells them otherwise.
Yeah, well, Imran, the model of Embark Chicago seems pretty time and labor intensive, which seems very much needed. But is it realistic to try to bring that model to scale at a large number of schools?
I think it is absolutely impractical to believe that the current model we have is ever going to give us results other than what many economists say, leaving us in a permanent recession. The loss of all of the intelligence, the economic potential of so many young people, we are in a permanent economic recession. But more than that even is the loss of the cultural sort of the identity, the knowledge, the beauty of all of that experience that we could be infusing in our kids' lives, in our lives. We are missing and losing all of that. It's impractical to think that we could do anything other. So, but to answer the question, yes, it's very realistic. I'll tell you why. Ask teachers, ask your callers, as they're saying, when you are able to take young people outside, you're able to build culturally affirming spaces. It's not the teacher's job always to be the one who teaches the young people. It's the teacher's job to create the environment in which young people can learn and become themselves and practice. And that has to be done with the community. It can't be a teacher's job to be able to affirm and constantly tell young people who they are. It is our job to provide the environment. So I think what we find is that this kind of teaching is infectious. It is so infectious that just giving people the opportunity, it'll grow like wildfire. And we've seen the same thing. The demand for Embark right now is through the roof. And we are working to be able to get the how and the what out to as many people as we can.
Well, we're running out of time, but I want to make sure we get the last few audience questions in. But before I do that, I want to put this question to both of you, what we've been asking all of our other panelists. If you're in a school that isn't embracing experiential or the Waldorf philosophy, what's one piece of your model that might enhance a traditional school structure? And Andrea, I'll start with you.
Well, I'm going to misbehave and I'm not going to give you one, but I am going to tell you that, first of all, there has to be some trust that students come with questions and a natural curiosity and a desire to learn. And there has to be trust in the teachers. Get out of the way and let the teachers teach. And let them go toward the resources in the city and the cultural treasures that we have, and incorporate them as they know they can for their students. And if you have to get very practical, let them move and do not cut the arts and music.
All right, and for you, Imran?
Well, I would say if you're an educator anywhere, I would ask your young people and ask your school and provide field experiences, as many as you can, to as many places as you possibly can take them. And I promise you, you will see the data that we see, dramatically improved connection to school, relationships with you and with classmates, dramatic shifts in outcomes all across the board. And other teachers will start coming to you and asking you, how is this happening? And they'll want to do the same thing. Start a movement within your building and make sure that the classroom is only a part of where our young people are learning.
And we have time for just a few questions, quick couple of questions actually. And this first one is for Andrea. Quasha on Facebook asks, how are teachers trained or prepared for Waldorf structures for learning?
Well, there are Waldorf certification programs. So in that way, that makes us like Montessori schools, and that, you know, whatever your education has been up until that point, you have ways to enhance your knowledge and efficacy with Waldorf learning.
We've got emergencies out there.
I know, we're in a busy corner.
Live stream going
We're
on.
right in the middle of everything.
This next question is for you, Imran. Adriana from YouTube asks, is there any trend at CPS moving from traditional models into a 21st century flexible learning / teaching model?
Absolutely. I think there are some really forward-thinking folks who have come in CPS, and they are working really hard to change how we are providing learning. I think we're seeing a lot of things like community days or experience days. We're seeing a lot of interest in developmental experiences or experiences that drive relationships and provide identity affirmation. We're starting to see so much more of that, because I think the number one thing is that all the research and learning we've seen, all of it coming out over the last 30 years, neuroscience and learning science and behavioral science tells us that providing young people meaningful experiences matter. And I think the school knows that it's a matter of equity, that we're making room for that learning. I'm proud to say that I think within the next 10 years, if we push super hard, we're going to see a huge wave shift across schools.
That's great. Well, that'll have to be our last question there. On behalf of WBEZ and the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government, we'd like to thank tonight's guests, Tim Knowles, Susan Patrick, Juan Carlos Ocon, Andrea Schaefer, and Imran Khan. And of course, thank you all for tuning in and sharing your bold ideas for reimagining education with us. And don't forget to check out WBEZ's events page to learn more about our upcoming live events, including our capstone event for the Reimagine series on September 22nd. That's at wbez.org/events. Please also be sure to take a moment to fill out our post-event survey and share your thoughts on tonight's event. That link can be found in the comments. And thanks again for joining us, and hope you all have a good night.